So right off the bat, as I often point out, the talks are about a very specific topic. And what that means is that everything that is spoken about is directly relevant and spoken about because it ties in with the topic of the talks. And the topic of the talks can be described in practical terms as happiness in daily living for the human being. And it's very important to define right up front that the word happiness doesn't refer to what is generally spoken about as happiness in general language. In general language, the word happiness is usually used to refer to a state of the human being that is a state where the human being feels good because of something that's happening in circumstance. So happiness really means, in general language, that something good happens and someone says, "Oh, I'm so happy at the moment," more or less because of what's happening. And so they're really talking about a happy feeling, which in this teaching refers much more, is spoken of as pleasure in the moment. So happiness in this teaching is referring to happiness in a very particular form, or rather we can substitute the word happiness for peace of mind. There's a reason why I don't start off saying that the talks are about peace of mind in daily living. They are about peace of mind in daily living. However, at some point, when we keep and look at life in a very practical sense, we will notice that whenever we have asked ourselves what happiness is in the past, or why am I not happy, what we were really asking is, or what we were really looking for, was happiness in the form of peace of mind, because that's the only happiness, or that's the only state that when it sets in, we will say, "Oh, this is happiness. This is the happiness I was really looking for, even when I didn't know it." What that means is this is the only happiness that is available that will satisfy the human being and allow them to sense and answer a question such as, "Are you happy?" with an answer that says, "Yes, I'm happy in life." That answer, "Yes, I'm happy in life," is an answer we can give when we have a general underlying state in life. And I'm suggesting that that underlying state is what we can call unbroken peace of mind. And unbroken peace of mind is simply the absence of what we can refer to as suffering. The non-arising of suffering, which in practical terms arises as guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And at the root of those different forms of suffering, there is a general sense, and that is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, which really all translates back to an uncomfortableness with oneself. So the talk is about happiness in daily living. Happiness in daily living doesn't refer to happiness as a feeling of pleasure, but rather as an underlying state of peace of mind, which isn't in itself a feeling, but rather is the state which can be classified as the absence, the non-presence, the removal of suffering. So it turns out that happiness is actually the absence of unhappiness, as opposed to happiness being the presence of great feelings. So whatever is shared in the form of words or written down is always a concept. So what is delivered in teachings, this teaching and any other teaching, are always concepts and not the truth. That's in itself, that's a concept. But it's a very important one to put into the teaching, because one of the causes of our uncomfortableness with oneself is a rigid idea of who we are, which essentially is a belief about who we are. And as I describe belief, belief is what sets in when there is a concept about ourself, and the concept is not recognized as being a concept and is therefore related to in an absolute sense. So I am a brother is a concept, but it's a concept from a very specific point of view. It's not absolute, because I'm also a son. I might be a partner, a business partner, or a social partner to people. So from different perspectives, I can be described differently. So I am a son, or I am a brother, is a conceptual description. And if we take that conceptual description and hold on to it as if it was some sort of truth, some sort of absolute, we exclude an understanding of ourselves in a more holistic way. So if I referred to myself as a son and held that in an absolute way, it may prevent me from knowing myself other than that. And the truth is that the human being has many more qualities and dimensions to it than a label can appreciate. And so having labels is useful and is not a problem as long as the label isn't turned into a belief, which really is an internal mental movement. So as soon as we understand the concept of what a concept is and the concept of what a belief is, then it becomes easier, more likely, more probable for the internal relationship to our own concepts to be what I would call healthy as opposed to unhealthy. So if you turn a concept into a belief, you've turned something that is relative and related to it as if it is absolute. So if, for example, Jesus was a human being and people believed him to be divine or immortal, and they held on to that as a rigid belief, it means that that concept is now obstructing the seeing of Jesus in a different light. The concept that the earth was flat was the standard concept about the nature of the earth going back several hundred years ago. And that concept was held in an unhealthy way by most people, as tends to be the case with concepts. This is probably one of the biggest dysfunctions that human thinking has, is to mistake relative information and hold on to it as if it is absolute. And what that tends to do is make us closed-minded, tends to make us rigid in our thinking and tends to make any opposing concept seem like an attack on who we are, because in the very act of turning a concept into something absolute, we identify as that being truth, and we therefore align ourselves with what we believe to be true. So a belief becomes intertwined into our idea of who we are, and that idea of who we are, therefore, is held as a belief and rigid, and that is the basis of our psychological identity that gets formed. So if I were to be asked what I think one of the major movements is in shifting our experience of life from being one that feels life to be very personal and receives a lot of what happens in life as an attack on who I am, which creates a sense of uncomfortableness, i.e. a life of suffering, and what it is that brings about a shift away from that to peace of mind or freedom. One of the ways I would choose to answer it concisely is a shift from having many beliefs to having no beliefs. Now, so that was what would I say is one of the most important things that brings about the shift, or one of the most important changes that happens that brings about a shift from suffering to peace of mind. And the answer is a shift from having many beliefs to having no beliefs. Now, when I say no beliefs, that doesn't mean to have no concept. I would say that I have no beliefs, but thousands of concepts. And how can you go to have no beliefs from having plenty of beliefs? And can you live life without any beliefs? And the answer in understanding that comes down to understanding the nuanced difference between concepts and beliefs. So once again, a concept is an idea, a description about how something is, a description of it relative to other things, a description of something relative to a specific point that you're making. And we can use concepts to describe things, to label things, to help people understand things as part of communication. And what we often do is turn a concept into a belief, which means we stop relating to it as a description and believe it to be truth. And by doing that, we become identified with the label. We become identified with the description as being the truth, as being the thing itself. It's a movement that prevents us from being present. It's a movement that forces us to live life through a lens of thinking. It's what is it's this dynamic that is referred to when spiritual teaching says, don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. Don't mistake the map of the territory for the territory itself. And so in spiritual teachings, what is delivered are concepts. And concepts are pointers saying, hey, look at that. I'm describing that in conceptual terms so that your attention can move towards that which is described. So if I say, look at the dog is a concept about a concept that we agree on as being the name for a particular animal in life. And if someone says, well, what is a dog? I don't know what a dog is. You say, well, it's a medium-sized animal with 4 legs. In this case, it's a white-haired dog. And so all of those are descriptions, and they're relative, because I've said it's a medium-sized animal. Now, relative to other animals like insects, it's large. So relatively speaking, it might be medium-sized compared to horses, and compared to mice, it's medium-sized. And relative to savanna-type African animals, If you pick the big ones, then it's not a medium-sized animal. And so the concept is accurate from a relative point of view. It's not an absolute truth. And if I describe the dog in enough ways, then someone knows, oh, he must be talking about that, as opposed to the bookshelf. So spiritual teachings are pointers. They're descriptions about various aspects or dynamics or objects or components of life. So we might talk about peace of mind, and we describe peace of mind as being not something, but rather the absence of suffering, the absence of uncomfortableness. We can talk about the flow of life as being the movement of circumstance from one moment to the next, a continuous flow of circumstance. And we can describe the flow of life as being a mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And we can describe pleasure as being the arising of a feeling that happens when circumstance is in line with our biological preferences. And we can describe pain as being the feeling that arises when circumstance is not in line with our biological preferences. So all of these are descriptions, pointers, concepts, not the truth. In another, relative to another topic, some of these descriptions may not be a description that someone would choose to run with. It may not be optimal to describe certain aspects of life with the same concepts as are used in this teaching, because in this teaching it's talking about the dynamics of life relative to happiness. So there's a specific reason those concepts are used. So let's not mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. Let's not get lost in thinking about the concepts and preventing the thinking from allowing us to actually see the terrain itself, to see daily life itself, which is what is being pointed at. So this movement from having beliefs to no beliefs, from having only beliefs, essentially, when our thinking only knows how to relate to concepts as right or wrong, and when it thinks it's right, it relates to it as absolutely truth, and this is the way it is. So we have now the idea that the Earth, generally speaking, is round. At some point, our belief that the Earth is flat got challenged, and then enough evidence was provided, and people said, oh wow, can you believe that we believed the Earth was flat when in fact it's not? And so now we believe the Earth is round. And if at some point in the future the nature of life is shown to be something different from being a universe of time and space, it might become clear that Earth is not really round from certain perspectives. And so we would see that the holding on to life as being, or Earth as being round as an absolute thing, may prevent the understanding of life or the universe in a more complete way. Now, the purpose of the talks here is not to understand the universe, that being an example. Ideally, what we will say is that I will run with the concept that life is, that the Earth is round. I won't run with the concept that the Earth is flat. However, I am happy to, even if I run with the concept that the earth is round, I also run with the concept that in practical terms, we live and we relate to the earth as if it's flat. We build houses on the principle that we are building houses on a flat piece of ground. We don't build houses as if they're going to fall off the earth. So in practical terms, we say, I live as if the earth is flat. And so this nuance shows us that if we are insistent on the concept the earth is round and we just keep holding it as absolute truth, and we were in a discussion with someone and insisting that the earth is round, we might miss that in practical terms we don't have to live as if the earth is round. So if we can hold on to concepts that are useful and work, and say, well, I'm going to run with the concept that in life that to make a hard-boiled egg, I need to put the egg in the water for whatever it is, 6 minutes, or soft-boiled egg, 6 minutes. It's a concept and it delivers a practical result. And so I will say that's a concept that I have. To make the perfect soft-boiled egg, you have to put it into hot water once the water is boiling for a time of 5 to 6 minutes, and then quench it under cold water. If you don't quench it under cold water, you might need to leave it in for less time, because it will continue to cook for some minutes while it's in the cup holder. So we can see that the concept of a perfect egg being between 5 minutes and 6 minutes in boiling water depends on its size, depends on whether you quench it, depends on whether you put the egg in the water after it starts to boil or when the water is cold. All of these factors. So if we say it's 5 to 6 minutes is the perfect time, and we get into an argument over it, and someone else says, no, it's only 4 minutes, we might be missing the fact that our concept is relative. Depends, they might be talking about a very small egg. They might be talking about how they like their egg as opposed to how you like your egg. So once we start seeing that concepts are always relative, that's a principle. That's a principle that applies to every concept we have about life. And that then can mean that we can, by default, have no more beliefs, because internally our thinking about concepts holds the concept as relative. Another reason why we hold concepts as relative is because we hopefully realize we could be wrong. We might not have all the information. We might be missing something in the question or in the topic that's being spoken about. So to hold our information, our concepts as relative, is very healthy. In doing this, we then get to question all of our beliefs as we see them come up in action. We see whether a concept has been turned into a belief. And every time we see a concept has been turned into a belief, if we've understood the principle that holding a concept as a belief is fundamentally wrong, it's a fundamental error, because a concept by nature is relative. It's a conclusion, a description from a particular perspective, processed through a particular mind that is relative, based on limited information or relative information. So by default, a concept is always very relative. And as soon as we turn it into something absolute, as soon as we hold it as if it is true, we've made a fundamental error. And our sense of self is based on this error. The holding of ideas about who we are and what life is, that we hold as absolute instead of relative. And what they do is they keep that idea of ourself in place, rigid. They force an identification with those concepts and beliefs such that we feel like that is who we are. And it is that identity that has become very rigid and absolute and unchanging that life smashes into. And the more those core beliefs are dissolved, the more that the core beliefs are loosened up and held as concepts, the more or the less dense our sense of self becomes. The less motivation we have to hold on to an argument, the less motivation we have to confirm our concept as being absolute and correct. The more easily we're able to listen to someone else's idea about life and not feel challenged by it. Because we say, that's a concept. Internally, we relate to what they're saying as a concept. You know, if someone comes along and criticizes something that I'm saying, very often I see that that's a concept that they have about what it is I'm saying that is based on a misunderstanding of what I'm saying, having listened to 2 minutes of what I've said rather than several hours. And it tends to be a concept that finds what I'm saying wrong based on a belief that they hold about how things are and who they are. And so if someone was to throw insult at me, that insult is a concept. So sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, is pointing at this, that the names are just someone's concept about you. Now, if your sense of self is rigid and includes in it the idea that I need life to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order for me to be complete, names are an attack on that sense of who I am. Because that sense of who I am is a belief, and someone else's concept will be seen as and related to as a belief. And so they are enemies. And so in that case, names really hurt us. Names are an attack on who I believe myself to be. In the absence of a strong psychological me, which essentially the point I'm making is that psychological me is a set of beliefs about who I am. In the absence of that, we tend to find ourselves gravitating, our sense of self gravitates to something, a dimension of the human being outside of the mental realm. And as we find ourselves gravitating to a dimension of the human outside of the mental realm, we come into appreciation of life in a way such that we're not seeing life as an attack on this idea of who I am, but rather we find ourselves in harmony with life. We start to see the diversity of life without the diversity seeming like an attack on who I am. And so it's so essential, if peace of mind is going to be there, for a regrounding of ourself outside of the mental dimension. And that regrounding can only happen when it becomes clear that the obsessive thinking of the thinking mind, the obsessive thinking that stems out of a rigid belief about who I am and what I need and what is good for me and what is bad for me, that regrounding happens when it becomes clear that all of those thoughts are outputs of a deeply ingrained belief. And that means that the deeply ingrained belief is an error. It's a fundamental error, as I've just described. And therefore, the narrative that comes from that is a continuation of the error. And if a part of our system recognizes that none of that can be believed, meaning nothing should be believed, then we become more capable of saying, who cares? Like, who cares in that nonsense? Let it be. And for a while, that's exactly what we need. It's to let it be, because the ingrained pattern is still there. And so life will trigger the resistance, which is this psychological self being fired into action. And the psychological self will feel bad about what's happening, will try and defend its position, will blame the other for circumstance that seems to be back on one's completeness and one's happiness. It will feel shame, So that psychological identity will, feel shame for not having done certain things that it thinks it should have done to prevent certain outcomes. And to the extent that we understand that that narrative, that psychological movement, is essentially an error, is based on an idea of oneself that is very rigid and limited and inaccurate, then letting those thoughts be, not being involved in them, there's nothing to say about them. So in the same way as if someone is criticizing something that I say, I accept I could be wrong, because in fact, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying this is a concept. If it resonates, hold on to it. Don't hold it as truth. It isn't the truth. So if someone is interpreting it as truth and therefore criticizing it on the basis that they think it's truth, I might try and point out that that's the case. And if they continue to push their point and miss the point of what I'm saying, that it's just a concept, I can then understand that it's because its psychological structure is a certain way. And after a certain amount of effort to try and explain the situation, primarily for their benefit, you can just let it be. You would let it be. It's like, oh, I can't fight, I can't win against deeply ingrained belief. So the best approach is to actually say, yes, you're right. From the perspective of understanding that everything in life is happening according to God's will, everything in life is happening according to destiny, exactly as it's meant to be. And so it's meant for that person to misinterpret what's being said. It's meant for that person to criticize. And there's no reason to fight against it. And in the same way, when we see our own suffering thoughts arising and we understand that they're from a deeply ingrained structure, we let them be. And in letting them be, there is a drifting into a dimension of the human being that's still and silent and at peace even with the concepts which are held maybe as beliefs being there, and a non-involvement in that. So what we resist tends to become a problem. So, if you find someone in the comment thread and then you see this debate, and sometimes it can deteriorate into attacks, at some point you just can you can step back and leave them to it. And if you happen to be one of the people drawn in, you realize, what if I just allowed that comment at the very beginning to just be? It goes nowhere then. Often we're compelled, we're drawn into a battle with comments that challenge our sense of self. It's okay for people to be wrong. It's okay for people to have different ideas. It's okay for us to be wrong. And one of the nicest things is to be able to admit that you're wrong, that you got something wrong. Because it's not personal. It's like, oh, I'm sorry that I said this about the situation. I see that I was wrong. When we understand that, when we relate to what we're saying about the situation as a concept, we can be wrong and be okay about being wrong because we haven't related to what we have said as a truth. If we relate to it as a truth, then admitting we're wrong is a much harder um, movement. So you say, oh, I'm pretty sure the bus comes at 11 o'clock. And if you relate to that as a concept, then you know that you're not absolutely sure that it comes at 11 o'clock. And the other person says, no, I think it comes at 10:30. And you go, well, I think it comes at 11. And so even when you think it comes at 11 and you will say, it doesn't come at 10:30, it comes at 11. If you can be relating to that yourself as you're saying it, as a concept, which also means I might be wrong. I might have misunderstood which bus they're talking about. I might have misunderstood which bus stop they're talking about. I might have got 11 o'clock fixated in my head when in fact I've always caught it at 10:30 and now I just think that it was 11 o'clock. This is healthy. This is healthy relationship to thinking. When we can see how our mind, our thinking can change a time from 10:30 such that we're convinced we've always caught the bus at 11 o'clock. And then when we realize that this is what's happened, we can laugh at the fact that this happened because we understand in principle that these things happen. When we take concepts as truth, we're not holding the possibility that our brain can be so convincing with a memory that is wrong. And so then when we realize that it really was 10:30, we always caught it in 10:30, and for some reason 11 o'clock was in our head. If we were saying 11 o'clock as if it was the truth, we feel very embarrassed and unable to admit the error. If we hold it as a concept, then it's, yeah, I was wrong. So what are some of the most important concepts that are held as truths in life? One, that life is as we perceive it. That's one of the general mistakes that we make in life. We assume that life is the way we know life. We don't realize, we don't appreciate that what we see in life is very relative. It's through a very limited set of apparatus. We often don't appreciate that our memory after a certain amount of time is misguided, is telling us a different story about what happened in the past. We don't appreciate that our brain tends to have a lot of biases in it and tends to hear questions a certain way when in fact clearly the question wasn't being asked or the statement wasn't being made in the way that we interpreted it. So we tend not to once again appreciate the relativity of life and circumstance. We might not appreciate that what is pleasant to us is not pleasant to someone else because someone else is a different subject. Someone else is experiencing life relative to different biological preferences. And so as we start appreciating that life is much more relative than, or at least our experience of life is very subjective. If we don't appreciate that, we hold life as an objective reality, as what I know of life is how it is. And because we hold life as our experience of life as some sort of truth, then we have an idea about who I am as some sort of truth, and that means that who I know myself as within this belief system is as I experience myself. So the notion that I am primarily a physical entity is a very common interpretation of who we are, because the non-physical aspect of the human being may not be part of someone's experience. And so because it's not part of the experience, or not registered as part of the experience, the idea about oneself doesn't include anything that is non-physical. So we have an idea of life as being primarily a physical world, an idea of ourself as being a physical world. And if we don't question how true that is, it becomes very rigid. Another aspect we have about life, and in particular ourselves, is that we are the ones making everything happen, that we have agency over certain faculties, primarily the faculties of the human being. We have agency over the speaking and over the functioning of the body, over the decisions that we make. And what it is that we believe has agency, some imagined entity has been inserted into the dynamics of life, where in fact that variable, that agent, the doer, doesn't really exist. But because it feels like we are the agents, our idea about ourselves gets solidified as I am the agent. So once again, based on how life feels, the belief gets put in place. Now, if we don't see that there is quite possibly a belief based on how life feels, that I am a separate doer, meaning I am a separate entity that makes the decisions about what it thinks and what it says and how it acts internally, that there is some independent volitional entity that is in control. That's the belief. If we don't recognize that there is a belief, and beliefs unnoticed as being there because they're assumed to be truth. And when something is assumed to be truth, it's not seen as an object. When a concept is known to be a concept, it has become recognized as an object, essentially, as something relative by our own thinking. So if our own thinking understands that concepts are relative, we've already then started to hold them as objects. And when we hold something as an object, we can see it. When a concept is held as a truth, it disappears as an object and it becomes part of how we know ourselves. So that's why this discussion about concepts and beliefs is so important, because it equips us with new information that may be what allows us to start seeing the whole a range of beliefs that are really concepts turned into or related to as absolute, that are in the system. So the belief, I am the doer, I am the one that could have chosen to do life differently, is a concept held as a belief, and it dissolves into it, it morphs, it blends into the environment such that it can't be seen as a belief. And only once light is shone on it, said, this is the belief you have about who you are. And that belief, I am a separate independent entity, the controller. By default, a controller means it's not being directed by something else. So it means it's not connected to anything else. It means nothing has control over it. For it to be the controller, it has to be separate, independent, insulated. And this is a psychological invention. this idea of a separate, insulated entity that is in control of moving the body and determining what is spoken and determining how one feels. And this identity is the cause of human suffering, is the root of human suffering. That identity, that belief, is what creates the psychological separation. It creates the qualitative sense of being something alone and isolated and separate, whereas in fact we are expressions of life, we are modulations of life, just like the table and the chair is a modulation of life, the human being is a modulation of life, and the cells are part of a much bigger system. And this self-identity covers that up. It changes the experience of life such that the connectedness is obscured. So these new concepts that say you are not the doer. Life is happening, speaking is happening, the heart is pumping, that is happening. Emotions arise, thoughts arise, all of these things are happening, and there is no thinker of the thought. There is no speaker of the words. The speaker of the words and the thinker of the thoughts is embedded in the psychological identity. So whenever we say, if the question is asked, who is speaking? And you say, well, I am speaking. Who is this I? When we look at it, we find that the I is contained in the narrative. I did this. I should have done that. You did this. You did this and you should have done that. What you did hurt me. In that narrative, there is the inclusion of an I that is a separate doer that requires pleasure in order to be happy, and an inclusion of a separate other that is the doer. So the separate self exists in the narrative. If we look for it in life, we don't find the separate self. What we find is a biological instrument that is always functioning according to its complex design, essentially a biological instrument, a biological robot, functioning, speaking exactly the way that it has been configured to speak. This biological instrument has consciousness. So calling it a biological instrument doesn't reduce the human experience down. What I'm saying is the human experience is a result of the biological instrument. And this biological instrument can feel emotions, can think, can experience life with nuances and a depth. So describing ourselves as an instrument designed by life and functioning exactly to our design isn't an attack on life or an attack on ourselves. It's just a description that more accurately describes how we are. So if someone hears the concept, they might not like it because they're interpreting the concept as meaning that the human being is sort of two-dimensional or very limited because it's said to be a biological instrument. So we imagine instrument being some sort of crude machine. Whereas this instrument is far from crude. It's highly complex. And what is undeniable is that we exist. There is a sense of existence. Something exists. And if we try to put our finger on that existence, we find it's very it's very ephemeral in nature. It doesn't have a location. It's timeless. It's what we can refer to as awareness or consciousness. And so that is part of the human biological instrument, a biological instrument through which consciousness is functioning. And the experience that we have in this moment is the present moment conscious experience. And the more that we become familiar with life from a different perspective to what has been ingrained, the more possibility there is of our experience changing. So really all these words are hopefully bringing us to a simplicity. We don't have to become experts at understanding all these concepts. Sometimes we think that until we understand it, in such a way that, you can sit in front of an audience and give a talk like I'm doing, that you're going to be missing something. And that's not really the point of the talks at all. The talks are really saying life is really quite simple when we're not trying to get somewhere. When our attention comes into the magic of the present moment and realizes something exists. That is undeniable, that I am presence, that I am that which exists in this moment, and that I am includes or is the awareness of life. That in itself is profound and doesn't require a whole lot of understanding of physics and profound spirituality or profound science, or doesn't require a huge intellect. It's just about awareness, becoming aware of life as this present moment, and maybe appreciating the awareness of the sights and the sounds and the tastes and the smells and the emotions, and even awareness of the sense of existence. If we start to appreciate that thinking obscures the simplicity, the simple beingness, if we start to realize that, there will be more and more times when our thinking gets abandoned just for a moment or two. It'll pick itself up again, no doubt. So to have it abandoned every now and again, which really happens when the system understands that thinking is not what life is all about. That what life is about is appreciating the experience, which is the experience in the present moment, and then thinking can be there as a component. Once our attention has come into the present moment, then there's no problem with thinking being part of the present moment. When the thinking is not seen as a component within the present moment, then it's what obscures ourself from grounding in this timeless aspect of the human being. So without further ado, I think we will address a couple of questions and then wrap it up. Hi, Luca.
Hey, how you doing?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So, I wanted to talk about, I think it's really important when certain emotions that can seem negative come up, like irritation. But yeah, and sometimes you can think that that's like directly suffering. But I think what's
Mm-hmm.
important is that there's like a resistance to that, and that actually it's just like, because it is sometimes it's really hard to tell because you're so used to seeing it in such a bad light, but it's actually
Mm-hmm.
just a movement, an energetic movement in the body.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, and just like seeing it, and also recently that there's been lots of like resting and being, like the body's doing that a lot, and it's
Mm-hmm.
visible in the heart, which is good. And also I noticed the body's very tired, and
Mm-hmm.
I saw a video where you talked about it, and I was like, oh, that might be what it is, you know, because you said like there's like an energetic component without the deep beliefs, and it can tie the body. I actually thought be the opposite, that as the psychological mind slowed down, the body would have more energy, and it probably
Mm-hmm.
will eventually. But I didn't think at all that it would actually make me more tired.
Yeah, that's a phenomena that I've definitely experienced, and the way I sort of rationalized it, or my concept about it, was that as we um, as we hear new concepts in teachings, so often you can get wiped out if you read a page of especially the top-down teachings that talk about life from a radically different point of view and talk about your true nature as awareness and consciousness and untouched by the flow of life. And um, you can sometimes read one page and just feel wiped out and um, need to take a nap for an hour before you um, can get on with things. Um, and so, because this kept happening for me, I formed a concept, which once again, it's not necessarily the truth, but it's what seemed to make sense based on my observation, is that I figured that the new concepts are sort of like an antivirus or a antibiotic or something that gets injected into the system as new conditioning, and it sort of fights against the existing belief structure, and a bit like your immune system fighting against an illness or a physical illness. The physical immune system will take energy away from other parts of your functioning in order to have enough energy to fight the illness. And I like to think of the concepts coming in from teachings as essentially equipping your um, your immune system, your wisdom immune system. And once your wisdom immune system gets hold of the concept, the accurate concept, it goes to work on dismantling um, some of the deeply ingrained beliefs that are based on an opposing concept that has been turned into a truth. Um, and that requires energy. So we feel wiped out while the the wisdom immune system is doing its work. So you can then be friends with your tiredness and
Okay, that's
give
good.
into it. Yeah.
I also like to point out that like when yeah, the thought patterns come up, like negative thought patterns, or like, you know, like old thought patterns that keep on like that were dominating the system for a long time. That there shouldn't be like, not that there shouldn't be, but it's more adequate for peace of mind if there's no resistance to that, because then there can be like an involvement. Oh, that thought shouldn't be there, and oh, the thought of now the peace of mind's being disturbed. They're just letting it be there, just letting it
Mm.
rest, and then, you know, it's okay if it's there. And eventually, I found that the thoughts were kind of like I used an analogy like clouds in the sky, where the
Hmm.
thoughts would just come. Even if it's lots of thoughts, it doesn't matter, because they just come and then they just go, and nothing happened.
Yeah, that's this whole principle that everything is predetermined and is a happening according to God's will and not your will is, and also the talk that expectation is a form of suffering. Those two things hopefully will allow an acceptance of suffering and allow an acceptance of these thoughts to be there, not as your doing, but as your destiny in this moment. Um, and as you said, if there is an allowing of those thoughts to be there, which requires the system to be able to hold them in a light that understands that the thoughts being there are not you or life malfunctioning, but that's a very common color that has been used in painting the present moment is suffering, a specific type of thoughts, and also painful events. So once our system starts to see both pain and suffering as part of the life experience, then the resistance to it tends to fall away because the resistance to it is part of our idea that life shouldn't have pain and shouldn't have suffering. Um, and so the same applies to what you were saying about irritation. Irritation may well be just a biological movement, and we resist it when we have this, this strong attachment to the painful biological movements not being there and only pleasurable biological movements. And so that's why it said the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That's the nature of the flow of life. And so wanting it to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure is an expectation on life that is going to lead to frustration because the nature of life is not going to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So ultimately, we require the non-attachment to pleasure and pain, which means really the understanding that life can be pleasure and pain, and that's not an attack on who I really am. And if primary suffering does arise, which really means there is an attachment to pleasure and pain, and then we are blaming or feeling guilt, hopefully the same understanding kicks in and says, okay, the primary suffering is arising, which is a result of the circumstance and my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is forcing me to get attached to circumstance being different, which is creating the primary suffering. But let's look at the primary suffering as just a happening. And if we do, then there's an acceptance of the primary suffering and no secondary suffering on top of the pain of the moment, the primary suffering, but no secondary suffering. So, in essence, I'm affirming and agreeing with what you're saying is that as the more we're able to accept even the suffering, that means the less expectation is arising, the less attachment to life being a particular way, I mean more surrender to life being exactly the way it's meant to be in each moment, and that's more peace of mind.
I'd like to mention one last thing, which I haven't heard any other spiritual teacher talk about, and I've only listened to you mention this thing, and that's you call it the red carpet, and it's kind of like a sense of adventure. Like I feel like I'm on an adventure, and it's like really exciting, and I feel like life is like I don't know how to explain it. It's like such an intricate journey, you know. Like
Mm-hmm.
I listen to the thing I hear is exactly when I need to hear it, and all these things that are kind of like coming together, and I remember feeling this, but nobody would ever talk about it, and then you talked about it, and I was like, yes, that. It was,
I called it the magic carpet ride, not the
oh,
red carpet. I think you said the red carpet,
yeah, yeah,
but
magic carpet.
magic carpet, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, there's going to be a lot of seekers listening as well that mightn't agree with us, because it really depends on one's destiny of how the seeking unfolds. If we find ourselves getting stuck for extended periods, then it feels quite the opposite. It really feels like we're not on a magic carpet ride and we're just stuck. Um, and it's also true that you can have a mix of both. You know, sometimes it feels like things are just going with the flow and unfolding, and everything is coming exactly like you need it, and there's very little sense of being stuck. And that's when real trust kicks in, because you know you're not doing this, especially when you see the intricacies of how the beliefs get undone, and how you start to see life and the experience changes, and then that adds to the transformation. That's when we really have a trust and see the non-doership of life. Um, and then we can find ourselves in a flop, and that sense sort of gets sucked away, and we really um, feel like, you know, all the flow is gone, and might even feel like it's not going to start up again. So to the extent that the seeking does feel adventurous and does feel like grace happening and does feel like life is supportive, I think we need to be extremely grateful for that.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answers. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Thank you for your answers. Very helpful.
you're welcome. Thanks for dropping in, Luca. Hi, Shaista.
Hello. Hi, Roger.
Oh,
How are you?
hi Roger, how are you?
Yes, very good. And you?
Yes, very well. Thank you. Um, the week you were off, and there was a lot of contemplation was happening, and um, as this previous guy mentioned, I'm feeling the same. So my whole body's aching like so much. You'll be thinking you're a doctor and we're coming to you, but I can feel it's directly related to this your teaching, I should say. It's like my whole body is stiff, and all my joints are hurting, my back is like as if, and it's definitely related to that, because when the beliefs and all that, it comes and it's seen or is challenged, it's happening sort of by itself, or I feel resistance also.
Mm-hmm.
um so but it's happening a lot, and it's instant, like a thought comes or something, I resist, and I instantaneously feel that those pains.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so, and I feel fear. And there's nothing I can see directly that what's the fear for, but I feel myself. So there were days, I was in total peace, total acceptance, and like really really good, and there are but still the pain was still there, but it's not noticeable and stuff. But other times it's obviously it's then the, as you said, flip flop. So perhaps I go to the other side. As such, there's no resistance where, when I used to have in years, like previous years, when I would resist and I could see the resistance. It's not that anymore. um
Mm-hmm.
but something definitely is there, and I don't know what it is. uh, I don't, there's nothing I need to sit with, or but I resist things. And
Things and
here again, I don't know whether I'm making sense or not, I'm just saying things. But so I have days when there's clarity, nothing needs, asking, or I don't have any questions even now. um but I don't know what's happening.
Um, it can be useful to hear about, hear
Sorry,
descriptions
I
or
can't hear
concepts
you. One
about.
second.
No?
Yes, I can hear you now. Sorry.
Okay, it can be useful to hear descriptions or concepts about what these pains might be. Now, you never know. You might have some real medical situation you need to look at. So once again, these are concepts for you to throw around and test and let go of them when they stop being useful. But just like you said, you have this sense that the pain is very much, you said, definitely related to this process. Now, if we say definitely, we might have turned it into a belief, into a truth. So we want to say, it feels very intuitively like it's related to the process, like but maybe it's not. Maybe I'm not seeing something. I do think it is very related to the process. My experience is that when certain beliefs are released into the system, they can come out from the subconscious into the conscious, a bit like trapdoors opening up. And then that energy is in the body. We can start to get tired. We can start to feel very emotional. We can start to feel suffering and be more fragile to blaming or to feeling shame or sense of despair. And then I found as those energies move around the body, they tend to find places they want to hang out and hide. And big muscles seems to be one of the places that energy tends to gravitate towards. And so that's when that happens, if some energies come out from the subconscious into the conscious, into the body system, they gravitate towards muscles, and that's what creates stiffness, and it can even create physical pain. I remember one time being out walking, contemplating something shifted, and then suddenly I felt this pain in my shin, and it really felt like the shin bone had cracked, had broken. Every time I put pressure on my foot, it felt like the bone had cracked. And it was odd because I hadn't done anything that could have broken the bone from one moment to the next, and yet it felt so much like a broken bone. And so I sat down and I was massaging some muscles that were stiff, and then an emotion came out and some vision associated. It was sort of like a little past life vision, and I felt a release of emotion and an insight about how that event that was in the visualization. So it feels like a past life. I don't know that there ever was that event that was visualized, so I don't hold it as there are past lives and that was what that was, but it appeared as if that's what it was. And in the release of the emotion, which was, let's say, a sadness to do with what was being visualized, something came out of the system. And then the shin, the pain in the shin was completely gone. The sense that the bone was broken was completely gone. And I had no problem walking. And that was probably the most direct correlation that I can remember, although I had many of those sort of correlations, but none as specifically direct. And I think because in that case, it felt like the bone was broken rather than just a muscular tension. And in an instant, it had vanished. And so that demonstrated to me that it's quite possible, in fact, probable, that these energies, as they're being released in the body, do tend to want to find a home and can create very, very specific physical sensations.
Right. No, that makes sense. I mean, yes. Also, lately I can see, both sides of all the concepts, and I think listening to you, it has really opened up that one could see both sides of the concepts or even beliefs or anything, even what you're saying. Having said that, it's so although this concept that I am not the doer or the other person is not the doer, and that's a concept also. So the concept like I'm not the doer, that's a concept. But how does it should I say, like in all concepts one could see the other concept like the other side of it also. That, but in this one, this seems very like you're not the doer, so that's, or I'm not the doer, so it seems very that you cannot have the opposite of that.
Well, you can, like, I'm not the doer. The opposite is I am the doer, right? And
But with
real
regards to
non-doer.
yeah, sorry, but with regards to teaching, or like how should I say, like I'm not the doer at the moment. I feel it's a concept. I mean, I'm taking it as a belief. I don't 100% see it that I am not the doer. So that's personal thing is one thing, but the other thing I guess I want to know that it's how can I relate to it in a way that everything else seems okay. It could be or it could not be, and you could see both sides. But this is so solid. I mean, obviously it's in myself, that if I'm not the doer and it's a belief, how is this just a belief? Whether I'm making sense or not.
Uh, well, you might be the doer, and then you have the belief you're not the doer.
Mm-hmm.
So then it would be a belief, right? Uh, if the notion that you are not the doer is a mistaken concept, then if someone believes it, they're believing that they have a belief. Now, even if it's not a mistaken concept, if it's an accurate concept and someone believes it, it's still a belief. So the question is, well, how can you hold it such that it's not a belief? And so if it's a belief, what happens is you have the doer being the non-doer, or the doer thinking that they are not the doer. Now, I am not the doer is not meant to become a new identity. So you don't want to be the non-doer. So this can you mute the what? So with it, can you still speak, Shaista, or not?
I can, yes, I'm here. I'm listening to you.
Okay. So this I am not the doer very easily will be taken as a belief by the one that believes they are not the doer. And so the belief of, or the concept of non-doership isn't meant to be turned into a belief, but rather it is a prompt to remind us that the thinking of doership is misguided. So when there is thinking that arises and it can be seen that that thinking is based on the belief in doership, like, oh, if you're feeling really bad about something that happened in the past, and there's a narrative that says, I really wasn't a very good daughter or good employee or whatever, and there's an uncomfortableness with it. You are not the doer is really just a prompt that is there to cut off the doership belief. It's really not meant to be turned into an identity. And in order for it to come up and cut off the doership narrative, we have to understand on what basis, like what does I am not the doer mean? And so it's pointing at the fact that there is the human being, and the human being is essentially functioning according to its design. But so the question is, who wasn't a good daughter? And when the belief in doership is there is the idea that I, the doer, the one that could have been a good daughter, wasn't a good daughter. Now, when we really look at it, there was only ever an instrument that functioned one way. And so when we look into that, there is no who, there is just the instrument functioning. And that needs to be understood, that for as long as the belief in doership is there, we won't see clearly that there is no one, there is no, so who could have been a better daughter? That would be the question that we ask. Who? And you might say, I. And I say, who? Who is this I? And at the end of it will come down to the fact that the I is a biological instrument that couldn't have functioned differently.
Yes. Yes, it makes sense when I do all that, and in so it's so for the past and future, it doesn't really give me problem as such. Future perhaps a little, but in every day I have this. I feel the um, the the control I have. I still feel it's there, and I feel controlling or mm, uh, that's yeah, it's there. So in the present moment, I feel not all the times, but sometimes that it's there. Uh,
Hmm.
the doership.
So then, yeah, so hopefully the thought can arise and say, this feeling of being attached to outcomes or thinking that you are in control of the outcomes or thinking that there is this individual that can act differently to their design. So hopefully a thought comes up and says, that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, I know that on many levels, I know that's not true, and there is as such nothing in my control. But I feel you're right. Attachment to outcome, they both go hand in hand, and since that's there, it's there also. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. So the non-doership will see that it's there because of not your doing. Right?
Mhm.
So even when it's there can be a relaxation with it being there. And so the relaxation is, it's here because it's God's will. It's here because it's life expressing itself this way. What we mean by life is the enormity of the entire universe unfolding over the 13.8 billion years has culminated in this moment exactly the way it is, which includes from time to time the sense of personal doership, and at other times, meaning the culmination of the whole universe up to this point in time, the absence of the sense of personal doership. And who is doing that? There's no one doing it. There is the culmination of the whole of the universe expressing itself that way in this moment.
Yes,
So
it is so
no
funny.
shy,
You remind
no
us
shy.
and we remember, and then it's when you remember, it's all clear. When you don't remember, it's you're in head and it's all going on. So it's very simple now that you have explained. Of course, we know that.
That's destiny. The confusion is destiny, right? The
Yeah.
same principle. Life expressing itself in this moment. So why is this moment exactly the way it is? Because of the fact that everything happened before it exactly the way it happened before it. And if you prefer to remove the causality, another description of life is that life is spontaneously arising in this moment, non-causally, not because of anything that came before it, but because matter is emerging continuously out of nothing. And that means that your doership in the moment is part of the expression of nothing as something. And so that clearly, whichever view of life you want to take, and it's even beautiful to take both views overlaying each other where they're not contradictories, where you can see there is a causal story and each frame is fresh and independent of the causal story, that all of time exists as a component in the present moment experience. And at the same time, it exists in the present moment experience, and it may well have existed as a continuum within time and space. Whichever view you take, it's causal, it's spontaneous, or it's a mix of spontaneous and causal. There's no doer. And yet in experience, in the present moment, there is the belief in doership, there is the suffering if it's there, and that's just life happening.
Yes, no, thank you very much. It's clear, and also it's such a simple thing. It's a resistance, which we have, and as you said, then the layers upon layers, and before you know, you're all drowned, and then the clarity comes. So it's like this way and that way it's happening. But thank you so much for your literally tireless teachings and your words. They are really truly helping us every single moment. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shaista. Yes. Hi, Erica.
Oh, hi, Roger. I'll let you see me today. How are you?
Very good.
Good.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed the first thing you said. What did you say about today?
I just said it's very good to see you again.
Oh yes, indeed.
Boy, what a wonderful satsang today. I'll tell you, I had a question, was to ask you to speak on trust, and of course, then you just dropped it right in. You said that's when the real trust gets in, and you were speaking, I believe, about the magic carpet, and so that you can speak more on that or not, but I have another question. I watched Gautam Sachdeva the other day.
Yes. Yes.
And a very deep, deep cry. And I'll also link it to the other questioner about the tiredness. It infused and also, I guess, took or released in some ways some things. And so I was very deeply tired. He's a beautiful, beautiful person.
He is.
Anyway, yes, he said this phrase, and I wrote it down because I loved it so much. He said, "Alone there is no happiness. Therefore, your consciousness assumes the role of the guru and disciple."
Mm-hmm.
Who is that from, or is that Gautam?
I don't recall having heard it before. Maybe that's how he expressed it. I guess it was in relation to Guru Purnima, which was on the weekend, right? On Sunday.
Yes, perhaps, yes. And another statement he said, and I'll tell you, I wasn't able to listen to the whole thing. I just got so overwhelmed, but I will finish it. He said he was speaking again about the guru, the bringer of light, and then he made the statement of the gurus of last resort, and I laughed, 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 and even just now I can't do anything but laugh at that beautiful little gem right there.
Which ones were the gurus? The gurus of last resort? Do they have a certain characteristic?
Basically, maybe myself or any of us, and the maybe not the ones we least expect, but just they are brought forth, I guess, forward somehow, and it's good. Yeah.
Yes. On gurus, I think it's very important for us to recognize that ultimately it's the Sat Guru inside that needs to get activated. And at first, we sort of need to hand over to the external guru, but really they're activating the internal wisdom, and that ultimately takes over and becomes the real teacher, is our own Satguru, the internal guru. And the external guru is always fueling the fire in a sense. I don't necessarily think it's about the external guru, falling away at a certain point. Both the external guru and the Satguru fall away together because I think they work in harmony. But really, what's important is no seeker is dependent on the external guru. It's really they're just stoking the fire. And if someone hands over their power psychologically, it really means they believe that they don't have what is being spoken about, then that's an error, an obstacle that needs to be corrected. Eventually we need to find this internal movement happening. But until that happens, then the sense is that I need something from outside. But I trust that once a ripeness happens, then, well, a ripeness is a shifting such that the internal guru takes over. And on the topic of trust, there's an interesting way of looking at things that's a bit of a tragic joke as well, or demonstrates the tragic joke. I get the sense that if we don't trust life and we see life as the enemy, and our attitude is of resistance and seeing things outside as an attack on who I am, which therefore means we defend and we attack back, then the cruel joke is that life says, okay, well, you see me as your enemy, that's your attitude, so I'll deliver hardship and that sort of type stuff. Now, the joke of it is that it's life itself that puts in that attitude and that sense of being, feeling attacked by life and therefore defending and whatever. And at a certain point, it's a bit of a catch-22, but at some point it starts to change, and life starts to deliver some things that allow us to relax and to trust a bit. And then as soon as life does that and it sees a relaxation and a trust, life says, okay, now you're treating me as your friend, so here's some more stuff, good stuff, results, and
Yeah.
and then we get to relax a bit more, and life says, okay, you're treating me as your friend, here's some more stuff. And as I said, the tragedy is that whether we see life as an enemy or as a friend is not in our control. It's not our doing. It's a shift that happens based on really our circumstance and our attitude to the circumstance, which is all part of destiny unfolding. But I hope that some people can get a sense of what I'm saying, is that at a certain point there is a shift from not trusting life to trusting life. And as we trust life more, we find that more and more abundance tends to present itself.
I fully agree. I fully agree. Um, as far as the body Shaista was speaking of, I too have difficulties, but it's okay. And sometimes the volume is lower and less. And Gautam also said something that I do get body work done to help with my physical pains. And he said, I don't exactly know how he phrased it, but I wrote down liquefy the congealment. And I took it to, you also said today, the energy hides in the big muscles and the doership, the ATO, the condensed emotions. And so moments lately of a lot of that congealment being powerfully blown up.
Yeah, yoga, massage, stretching,
Yeah.
hot showers, jacuzzi, all of this stuff, if it's available, is fun to play with, because the more we do that, the more we feel the correlation and the shifts in the energy, if that's how it's working in your body. I found that that's how it worked, and so the more that we start playing with these things, the more we can start to see how at certain phases we need certain therapies or certain complementary practices or additions to the seeking. And even if it for some people it's about a time comes when doing some tantra work or something which might not be part of your general path, but there's a time when it's very needed. And I think that we become aware of what's needed just as it's needed. So the fact you bring up this, that Gautam mentioned, massage, I used to do a lot of self-massage, just finding those points where the energy got stuck and rubbing in with knuckles or thumb. And it took quite a while for me to realize that maybe 4 or 5 hours later, the emotions started to move in the body, and I didn't create the correlation because of the 5-hour delay. And sometimes there's no delay; it can be sort of instantaneous. The way the emotions move through when massage is applied, but sometimes it's delayed, and once that gets seen, obviously it means that you can start to see the correlation 5 hours later on a more regular basis. And all of these little awarenesses, not only is the massage doing something, but then our awareness of what the massage is doing adds to our understanding of what's going on.
Very good. Thank you so much, Roger. And it's always a delight to speak with you. The art continues and dancing also continues. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks for dropping in. For those of you that don't know, Gautam is what we can call a guru brother. He's a great friend. We try to spend several weeks together each year, often when I go to India, and he shares talks in the same sort of tradition. He was at Ramesh's, would attend every Sunday. He lived in Mumbai and had his own businesses and other things to attend to, but Sunday he would be there. I think he never missed a Sunday, from what I understand. So feel free to check out his YouTubes, and he's got several books that are very much coming at the teaching well, not necessarily in exactly in the same way as me, but it's essentially the same teaching. So there's a great book that I recommend called Pointers from Ramesh Balsekar, which is by Gautam Sachdeva. So you can find that on yogiimpressions.com. That's where those are available. So I think we'll wrap it up on that note. Thank you for joining, and peace for now.